Hello and welcome to Untwisted Threads. In the beginning of my yarn creative journey, I had no clue what blocking was, what yarns did block, what blocking can do, or how to block my projects. I have received a few comments on how to block superwash yarn and how I block multiple times throughout my project, so I thought I would gather my thoughts, tips, and recommendations all about blocking your yarn projects. If you like learning about different yarns, fibers, or yarn-related videos like this one, consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. It is a small action that is free and it really helps us out. So for starters, what does it mean to block a project? It really is letting your project or finished garment soak in water for 15 to 30 minutes with a little bit of wool wash if you prefer, then gently pressing out the water and letting it dry. I'll go into a little more specific detail in a moment. But by letting the fiber soak in the water, it allows your project and your stitches to relax, and most of the time, it makes your stitches look more even or cohesive, especially with cables, lace, and colorwork. Now, not all yarns block the same, meaning your project will look very different at the end if you use a cotton yarn versus a wool yarn versus a synthetic yarn versus a superwash treated yarn. For cotton yarns, it has very little memory, so blocking is more to help with uneven tension and stitches than to get a certain measurement. For synthetic or acrylic yarns, these don't really block. What are they made of? Plastic. Plastic doesn't change in water. Unless you use heat or super warm water, then it'll melt. For non-superwash wool yarns, these block amazingly and will hold its shape very well. The yarn blooms, becomes softer, and the stitches become more uniform. For superwash wool yarns, these tend to grow a lot more in length and don't hold their shape as well as non-superwash wool does. I highly recommend knitting a good size swatch before knitting, measuring it, blocking it, and measuring it again. You can then use that difference in measurements to calculate, okay, my sweater will grow this much every time I knit this many inches or centimeters. Luckily, blocking your projects isn't rocket science and everyone has their own tips, tricks, and techniques. These are just mine that I have figured out over the past couple of years. Affiliate links to what I use or similar products are all listed down below, and a lot of these links are included in the description of our review videos too. With these links, you don't pay anything extra, but if you do decide to make a purchase, it does help the channel out if you'd like to support us that way. What I use: a tub or plastic container, depending on the size of the project I am blocking. Room temperature water, not to cause any felting. A towel to press out the water. Blocking mats, not required, but they are non-absorbing and allow your projects to dry quicker than if it was laying on towels. These next items are optional. A fan to speed up drying time. No rinse wool wash, which helps agitate the fibers less, which reduces felting and pilling. It also conditions and softens the fiber. Modern Daily Knitting has a great article written about this, and it's linked in the description if you'd like to learn more about it. Blocking pins, to manipulate your project into the shape that you want. Clips, if you're blocking only a certain part of your project and you don't want your entire project falling into the water bin. How I block an entire garment. This is the easiest way to block a garment, however, depending on the type of wool that you use, you won't know how much or how little your project will grow. I typically only block my entire project at once if it's a small project like hats, mittens, or socks, or if I'm in a time crunch and I don't have the extra time for me to block along the way. First, I fill up my tub or container with enough room temperature water to cover or soak my project. If you don't want your yarn to felt together, I do not recommend using hot water. The container size that I use will depend on how big my project is. My go-to for blocking swatches is a small plastic container like this. I think we originally bought this with lunch meat in it before I washed it and used it for an extra container. And for larger projects like a sweater, I use a tub like this. Yes, you could use a sink, but I highly recommend that the sink is sanitized or cleaned before you use it for blocking. This is also when you could add wool wash if you wanted. I personally have never used it before, but I would like to try it out in the future. Next, you submerge your entire project in the water. Make sure that every part of your project is covered by the water. If you look or listen closely, you should hear or see little air bubbles coming from your yarn. Now set a timer between 15 and 30 minutes. I try to leave my projects in on the longer time frame, and sometimes I forget that it's blocking, and my husband has to remind me that there is a container of yarn soup on the counter. When the time is up, lay out a towel fairly close to your container or sink. Gently grab your project out of the water, trying not to stretch it out. I find that putting it in a ball is the most effective. Then you will gently press out the water as much as you can. This step can get kind of messy, so maybe try not to have other things on the counter. Now, you will lay your project flat on the towel. It doesn't have to be perfect at this time. You will then roll up your project into the towel. Once it's rolled up, apply a little bit of pressure to try and get the remainder of the water soaked up into the towel. At this point, you can either use a few dry towels or blocking mats like these ones. Any foam mats that fit together like these ones should work great. Now is when you will be more precise when laying out your project. You want to lay it flat onto your mats or your towels. If it's not flat, you will have creases in places that you don't want it to. Some people use pins to hold the edges of their project in place as it dries, which in situations like a swatch where the edges typically curl up, I think that they would be super helpful. I personally don't use them though. Another optional step is to have an overhead or plug-in fan to help speed up the drying process of your project. You don't want a heater as non-superwash wools will felt and acrylic will melt. Our laundry room is the warmest in our house, so I like to keep my projects in there to dry. And now you wait. For sweaters, it typically takes a couple of days to dry. For smaller projects, it doesn't take as long. Swatches take a couple of hours, where mittens may take a day. I also don't weave in my ends until after my project is dried. In case I need to make any adjustments to my project, I don't have to unweave, fix my project, then reweave my ends again. Now for how I typically block my projects multiple times throughout the project, especially when doing color work, lace, and cable designs. I want to make sure my project is growing and looks right because that is a lot of valuable time, work, and energy to have to frog an entire project if there ends up being an issue at the very beginning that you could have prevented. So there are a few places when making a sweater when I like to block my project. If you're working from the top down, when I have completed my yoke and I'm about to split for sleeves, I block it. If I'm working from the bottom up and I'm about to split for front and back panels, I block it. After I have completed one sleeve, I block it to check the length before I start the second sleeve. Yes, if I'm not on a time crunch or have a deadline, typically I will block a project in 2 to 4 different sections before I complete the entire garment. At the end, if you feel the need, you can block the entire garment together, but I typically don't, as each time I block, the water overlaps at least an inch or two from where I last blocked, so in my mind, I think that makes it pretty cohesive. Now my steps are pretty much the same as when blocking an entire project. However, on step 2, where you submerge your project into the water, that is where I will change things slightly. If you're at the very beginning of a project and are blocking, I will submerge the whole thing. If you still have yarn attached, this is where the clips come in handy. These are just plastic chip clips that I already had around the house and they work pretty great. You can still block your project and clip the extra ball of yarn off to the side so it doesn't get wet. This is usually what I have to do. Very rarely does it line up perfectly where I'm at the end of a skein and it's time for me to block. If you have already knitted and blocked a section and you're ready to block a new section, again, these chip clips are going to be your best friend. Only submerge the section you want blocked into the water. Drape the section that you want to stay dry over the side of your container and clip it into place. Now, a little bit of water will soak into the dry section, but that's just part of it. How often you wash your garments will of course depend on how often you wear them and what kind of fiber it is made of. Cashmere, silk, and cotton should be washed about every 3 wears, while more hardy wools like Peruvian Highland wool or rustic wools can be worn about 5 times before washing. Also, if you wear something like a t-shirt or a tank top underneath your garment, this will extend the life of your garment in between washes, so that is something to keep in mind too. Now, I have never been taught how to block things. I kind of came up with my own methods to suit my needs, and they have been working for me so far. So if you have any tips or tricks, please share them in the comments below so others can hear about them too. And if you would like a part 2 of me trying wool wash versus not using wool wash, let us know in the comments below. I hope from today's video you felt like you learned something and can use pieces of my blocking techniques when you block your next project. And if I missed anything or if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time.